Aunt Frances will take care of her precious little girl. She'll make the bad sickness go away." Elizabeth Ann, who had not known that she was sick, had a picture of herself lying in a little white coffin, all covered over with white. In a few minutes, Aunt Frances was obliged to excuse herself from her callers and devote herself entirely to taking care of Elizabeth Ann. One day, after this had happened several times, Aunt Frances really did send for the doctor. He came briskly in, just as Elizabeth Ann had always seen him, with his little square black bag smelling of leather, his sharp eyes, and the air of bored impatience which he always wore in that house. Elizabeth Ann was terribly afraid to see him, for she felt in her bones he would say she had galloping consumption and would die before the leaves cast a shadow. This was a phrase she had picked up from Grace, whose conversation, perhaps on account of her asthma, was full of references to early graves and quick declines. And yet, did you ever hear of such a case before? Although Elizabeth Ann, when she first stood up before the doctor, had been quaking with fear lest he discover some deadly disease in her, she was very much hurt indeed when, after thumping her and looking at her lower eyelid and inside out and listening to her breathing, he pushed her away with a little jerk and said, "There's nothing in the world the matter with that child. She's as sound as a nut. What she needs is..." He looked for a moment at Aunt Frances's thin, anxious face, with the eyebrows drawn together in a knot of conscientiousness, and then he looked at Aunt Harriet's thin, anxious face, with the eyebrows drawn up that very same way, and then he glanced at Grace's thin, anxious face, peering from the door, waiting for his verdict, and then he drew a long breath, shut his lips and his little black case tightly, and did not go on to say what it was that Elizabeth Ann needed. Of course, Aunt Frances didn't let him off as easily as that. She fluttered around him as he tried to go, and she said all sorts of fluttery things to him, like, "But, doctor, she hasn't gained a pound in 3 months, and her sleep, and her appetite, and her nerves." As he put on his hat, the doctor said back to her all the things doctors say under such conditions. "More beefsteak, plenty of fresh air, more sleep, she'll be all right." But his voice did not sound as though he thought what he was saying amounted to much. Nor did Elizabeth Ann. She had hoped for some spectacular red pills to be taken every half hour, like those Grace's doctor gave her whenever she felt low in her mind. And then something happened which changed Elizabeth Ann's life forever and ever. It was a very small thing, too. Aunt Harriet coughed. Elizabeth Ann did not think it at all a bad-sounding cough in comparison with Grace's hollow whoop. Aunt Harriet had been coughing like that ever since the cold weather set in, for 3 or 4 months now, and nobody had thought anything of it, because they were all so much occupied in taking care of the sensitive, nervous little girl. Yet, at the sound of that small, discreet cough behind Aunt Harriet's hand, the doctor whirled around and fixed his sharp eyes on her. All the bored, impatient look was gone. It was the first time Elizabeth Ann had ever seen him look interested. "What's that? What's that?" he said, going over quickly to Aunt Harriet. He snatched out his little bag, a shiny thing with 2 rubber tubes attached, and he put the ends of the tubes in his ears and the shiny thing up against Aunt Harriet, who was saying, "It's nothing, doctor, a teasing cough I've had this winter. I meant to tell you, but I forgot, that sore spot on my lungs doesn't go away as it ought to." The doctor motioned her very impolitely to stop talking and listened hard through his little tubes. Then he turned around and looked at Aunt Frances as though he were angry at her. He said, "Take the child away, and then come back here yourself." That was almost all that Elizabeth Ann ever knew of the forces which swept her away from the life which had always gone on, revolving about her small person, exactly the same ever since she could remember. You have heard so much about tears in the account of Elizabeth Ann's life so far that I won't tell you much about the few days which followed, as the family talked over and hurriedly prepared to do what the doctor said they must. Aunt Harriet was very, very sick, he told them, and must go away at once to a warm climate. Aunt Frances must go, too, but not Elizabeth Ann, for Aunt Frances would need to give all her time to taking care of Aunt Harriet. Anyhow, the doctor didn't think it best, either for Aunt Harriet or for Elizabeth Ann, to have them in the same house. Grace couldn't go, of course, but to everybody's surprise, she said she didn't mind, because she had a bachelor brother who kept a grocery store, who had been wanting her for years to go and keep house for him. She said she had stayed on just out of conscientiousness, because she knew Aunt Harriet couldn't get along without her. If you notice, that's the way things often happen to very conscientious people. Elizabeth Ann, however, had no grocer brother. She had, it is true, a great many relatives. It was settled she should go to some of them, till Aunt Frances could take her back. For the time being, just now, while everything was so distracted and confused, she was to go stay with the Lathrop cousins, who lived in the same city, although it was very evident that the Lathrops were not perfectly crazy with delight over the prospect. Still, something had to be done at once, and Aunt Frances was so frantic with the packing up, and the moving men coming to take the furniture to storage, and her anxiety over her mother, she had switched to Aunt Harriet, you see, all the conscientiousness she had lavished on Elizabeth Ann. Nothing much could be extracted from her about Elizabeth Ann. "Just keep her for the present, Molly," she said to Cousin Molly Lathrop. "I'll do something soon. I'll write you. I'll make another arrangement, but just now—" Her voice was quavering on the edge of tears, and Cousin Molly Lathrop, who hated scenes, said hastily, "Yes, oh yes, of course, for the present," and went away, thinking that she didn't see why she should have all the disagreeable things to do, when she had her husband's tyrannical old mother to take care of. Wasn't that enough, without adding to the household such a nervous, spoiled young one as Elizabeth Ann? Elizabeth Ann did not, of course, for a moment dream that Cousin Molly was thinking any such things about her, but she could not help seeing that Cousin Molly was not any too enthusiastic about taking her in, and she was already feeling terribly forlorn about the sudden, unexpected change in Aunt Frances, who had been so wrapped up in her, and now was just as much wrapped up in Aunt Harriet. Do you know, I am sorry for Elizabeth Ann, and what's more, I have been, ever since this story began. Well, since I promised you that I was not going to tell about more tears, I won't say a single word about the day when the two aunts went away on the train, for there is nothing much but tears to tell about, except, perhaps, an absent look in Aunt Frances's eyes, which hurt the little girl's feelings dreadfully. Then Cousin Molly took the hand of the sobbing little girl and led her back to the Lathrop house. But if you think you are now going to hear about the Lathrops, you are quite mistaken, for just at this moment, old Mrs. Lathrop took a hand in the matter. She was Cousin Molly's husband's mother, and of course, no relation at all to Elizabeth Ann, and so was less enthusiastic than anybody else. All that Elizabeth Ann ever saw of this old lady, who now turned the current of her life again, was her head, sticking out of a second-story window, and that's all that you need to know about her, either. It was a very much agitated old head, and it bobbed and shook with intensity with which the old voice called upon Cousin Molly and Elizabeth Ann to stop right there where they were on the front walk. "The doctor says that what's the matter with Bridget is scarlet fever, and we've all got to be quarantined. There's no earthly sense bringing that child in to be sick and have it, and be nursed, and make the quarantine twice as long." "But, Mother," called Cousin Molly, "I can't leave the child in the middle of the street." Elizabeth Ann was actually glad to hear her say that, because she was feeling so awfully unwanted, which is, if you think of it, not a very cheerful feeling for a little girl who has been the hub round which a whole household was revolving. "You don't have to," shouted old Mrs. Lathrop out of her second-story window. Although she did not add, "You gump," aloud, you could feel she was meaning just that. "You don't have to. You can just send her to the Putney cousins. All nonsense about her not going there in the first place. They invited her the minute they heard of Harriet's being so bad. They're the natural ones to take her in. Abigail is her mother's own aunt, and Anne is her own first cousin once removed, just as close as Harriet and Frances are, and much closer than you, and on a farm and all. Just the place for her." "But how under the sun, Mother," shouted Cousin Molly back, "can I get her to the Putneys? You can't send a child of 9 1,000 miles without—" Old Mrs. Lathrop looked again as though she were going to say, "You gump!" and said aloud, "Why, there's James going to New York on business in a few days anyhow. He can just go now and take her along and put her on the right train at Albany. If he wires from here, they'll meet her in Hillsborough." And that was just what happened. Perhaps you may have guessed by this time that people usually did what old Mrs. Lathrop told them to. As to who the Bridget was who had the scarlet fever, I know no more than you. Maybe she was the cook, unless, indeed, old Mrs. Lathrop made her up for the occasion, which I think she would have been quite capable of doing. Don't you? At any rate, with no more ifs or ands, Elizabeth Ann's satchel was packed, and Cousin James Lathrop's satchel was packed, and the two set off together, the big, portly, middle-aged man quite as much afraid of his mother as Elizabeth Ann was. But he was going to New York, and it is conceivable that he thought once or twice on that trip that there were good times in New York, as well as business engagements, whereas poor Elizabeth Ann was being sent straight to the one place in the world where there were no good times at all. Aunt Harriet had said so ever so many times. Poor Elizabeth Ann!